Every man, woman, and child is in this fight for Ukraine. They are tired, don't get me wrong, and the constant bombardments of the civilian population is exhausting. But they are committed, they're confident, and they're very courageous, and they're going to keep on going.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer. And a year and a half after Russia's invasion, we are looking at the state of war in Ukraine. Why hasn't Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive been more effective? Based on my conversations with high-ranking officials, things are going more slowly and less successfully than NATO commanders had hoped and expected. And although it looks like Ukraine's military has recently launched a major thrust towards the south and the Sea of Asov, the tide of war has yet to meaningfully change. So what explains the disappointing results thus far? Is the West not doing enough to provide Ukrainian support? And if military resolution to the conflict isn't coming anytime soon, could diplomatic solutions be back on the table? To discuss all that and more, I'm joined by former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. But first, why is Russia trying to starve the world? Nearly a year and a half into its invasion of Ukraine, after the massacre of civilians in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha, after the indiscriminate shelling of Europe's largest nuclear plant in Zaporizhia, and after the torture of countless Ukrainian POWs, Moscow's latest move may be its cruelest so far. In July, Russia pulled out of a landmark wartime deal brokered by Turkey and the United Nations that had allowed for 33 million tons of food to flow from Ukraine to countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And soon after announcing their unilateral withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Russian forces engaged in strikes against the port of Odessa, destroying substantial grain stocks, while also inadvertently damaging the Chinese consulate there. Russian and Ukrainian grain exports have historically accounted for roughly 30% of global wheat and barley exports, a fifth of all maize, more than half of all sunflower oil. And thanks to the agreement, world food prices had declined by roughly 20%. Having said that, the disruptions aren't as problematic as they were at the beginning of the war. Now, some 50% of Ukrainian agricultural exports go through non-Black Sea routes, overland and by river, compared to only 10% before the war. And while Russian food exports are constrained by shipping challenges, much is still getting out. Russian wheat, actually, has just had a record crop. The question remains, why is it in Moscow's interest to spike global food prices? What does it have to gain from exacerbating hunger in the global south? Many of the African nations likely to be hardest hit, like Ethiopia, have taken pains to remain neutral in the Ukraine war. But maybe Putin is losing patience. Russian officials have railed against international restrictions on the country's agricultural goods and fertilizer companies, on Russian ship access to foreign ports, and on being shut out of the global payment system SWIFT. Enough, Putin is saying, is enough. And more urgently, is Putin growing restless with the pace of war in Ukraine? Russia pulled out of the grain deal soon after its Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia and Crimea, was damaged in what they called a terrorist attack. Ukraine has not officially accepted responsibility, but it's widely understood that Ukrainian water-based drones were responsible. And while the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive has yet to yield significant battlefield gains, there is no question that Russia's military is hurting. Why else would they announce that they're cracking down on draft dodgers and expanding the eligibility of its compulsory military service to, get this, 65? So what's a little global starvation, Putin may be thinking, if it hurts Ukraine too? Here now to talk about the state of Ukraine's counteroffensive is a woman who served as U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, that is, until she was fired by President Trump. You remember that whole impeachment thing. No, the first one. Here's my conversation with former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. Marie Yovanovitch, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So much I want to ask you about. We've been focused on this war, sadly, for close to a year and a half now. You've been back and forth to Ukraine, of course, quite a bit. Tell me what surprises you most on your latest trips.
I'm not sure at this point that there are that many surprises, although one of the things that reassures me and maybe does surprise me is how committed and confident the Ukrainians are, not just on the government level, not just the military, but the people of Ukraine. They are tired, don't get me wrong. And the constant bombardments of the civilian population is exhausting and terrifying. But they are committed, they're confident, and they're very courageous, and they're going to keep on going. I was emailing with one of my former employees who was a political officer, but it turns out he has all sorts of techie skills. And so he is now in the military working in a drone unit, and they had recently been attacked, and he told me that the local population is just all in. And a little boy came up to him after the attack and he said, "I've got this spent bullet for you and you can use it the next time the Russians attack." And I think that just is indicative of how every man, woman, and child is in this fight for Ukraine. They will do whatever they need to do, even if it's finding the spent bullets for the next fight.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get to you on things like ammunition because, of course, that's a big part of the story with the counteroffensive. Been going on for almost a couple of months now. Very little Ukrainian territory retaken. Also, nowhere close to the full number of troops that the Ukrainians have available to them and trained, used in the counteroffensive so far. Russians don't seem to be falling apart at all, despite what we saw with the Prigozhin Wagner debacle internally, holding on to the defenses. Where do you come out? How do you think the Ukrainians are doing? How do you expect them to do realistically over the next couple of months?
The Ukrainians are doing what the British call, they have a catchy little phrase of stretch, starve, and strike. In terms of the three steps of the campaign. And so the stretching part of it is what we're seeing now, which is the probing to find the weak spots in Russian defenses. The starving part is, hitting bridges, hitting munitions dumps, hitting railroad tracks, all of that, so that supplies can't get through to the Russians, and there is some effect going on there. And the striking part is once they've made a decision as to where the Russians are weakest, then they will bring in the NATO-trained and equipped troops, hopefully to come in and strike the Russians where they are weakest. I think what we've seen over the last 7 weeks is the Ukrainians first went in with larger units. And, as we saw, they lost a lot of equipment and they lost some men as well, sadly. I think now what they're doing is going in with smaller units, striking quickly, doing as much damage as they can to the Russians, and then pulling back. So the strategy is active attrition. It's not to gain territory at this point. I think that will come later when they are ready to strike. And so, we still have a number of months, October, maybe even November, depending on the weather of active fighting season. And I think the Ukrainians are going to take advantage of that.
Now, one of the big challenges has been getting them suitable ammunition to be able to continue that fight. The big debate recently has been about cluster munitions. Most allies do not want those weapons going to the Ukrainians. The Americans chose to provide them. What do you think the right decision is here and why?
I think it was a very difficult decision, first of all, because again, I think the Biden administration wants to keep the allies together and focused and united. So clearly this was a point of difference. But I think that we're also at a place where the Ukrainians don't have enough ammunition. We don't have enough ammunition to provide. We, the collective coalition, don't have enough ammunition to provide. So what do you do? And the answer came up, cluster munitions, which is not a great answer, but it is the answer that was found. I understand that people are critical of this decision because it's not one I would have wanted to make myself. But it's, in wartime, sometimes there's a clear right and a wrong. Other times there aren't. And Ukrainians are fighting and dying. And we, in my opinion, we need to provide them what we can so that they can prevail.
How should we think about negotiations? Right now it still looks like endless war. the Russians certainly have shown no inclination. I mean, I understand the easiest way to end the war is the Russians pull out, and that's a great thing to say. I think everyone would love to see that. It's not about to happen. Absent that, how should we think about a negotiations process? How might we think about a ceasefire process?
So it's just a really good question. And part of the reason that I'm hesitating is that the facts on the ground, when both sides are ready to actually negotiate and negotiate in good faith, the facts on the ground are going to determine a lot of that process, whether it's a ceasefire, whether it's something more long-lasting, what the actual border lines would be, and so forth. I think a lot of people are spending a lot of time thinking about various scenarios, and that's all good. But I think it's hard to sort of definitively say, this is what it's going to look like. And I would also say the Ukrainians have a lot of experience in negotiating with the Russians. And the Russians don't always, as you know, negotiate in good faith. In fact, more often than not, they don't. And specifically in 2014, 2015 with the Minsk agreements, where the international community, France and Germany, really held Ukrainian feet to the fire to stop the blood flow and everything else. And the Russians never, they signed, but they never did anything that was in that agreement, including honoring the ceasefire. And so I think Ukrainians are justifiably concerned that they're going to be caught in that same nightmare again, where there's an agreement where the international community keeps on looking at Ukraine to do its part, but too hard to make Russia do its part, and so we don't pressure the Russians. And so how do we get out of that kind of a dynamic? I think we need to think very carefully about that, because if we get into that kind of dynamic again, I think it's going to be the same kind of scenario all over again as what we saw before, where Russia regroups, rearms, and reattacks Ukraine, but maybe other parts of Europe as well.
So, I guess on that last front, if the G7 is truly committed to providing the kind of training and equipment and intelligence for Ukraine, essentially, the NATO is fighting this war in Ukraine with the Ukrainians. They're not providing soldiers directly in the fight, but aside from that, whether it's hitting the Kerch Bridge, or whether it's, taking out Russian, supply chains and the rest, the Americans are leading the way for Ukraine. If that's the case, as long as we know that's the case, why would we be so concerned about the Russians taking another bite at this apple? I ask in part because a big part of the reason why the Russians invaded a year ago, February, is precisely because none of that support existed for Ukraine.
So there's another question which you haven't asked me, which is what is going on in Russia, and I don't have a great answer for that either.
I'll get there. No, it's okay.
But that also, obviously, plays a part into what do future negotiations look like, because is the opposite member Putin or is it somebody else? And, we've already heard from Zelensky that he's not going to negotiate with Putin. That, may or may not come out to pass. But I think that will make a huge difference. And if it's Putin, I think he's got a track record, and he's told us what he wants to do. And I think that he's probably still committed to that vision of a greater Russia, the Russian Empire. He wants that for his place in history. And I don't think he's given up, and I don't think he gets good information. Even today, in terms of what is going on out there. And so if you haven't given up, if you're not getting good intel, you keep on going with your original plan. He still believes, I think, that the West is weak, that we will, avert our gaze to the next bright and shiny object, and we will forget about Ukraine and Russia, and that's when he's going to strike again. I think that's his game plan.
To talk about the Russians for a second, of course, there have been some people talking to the Russians and to this regime. We saw that the outgoing head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and someone that we've had on this show certainly, Richard Haas, has led a delegation, done some track 2 diplomacy with the Russians, and also spoke with Foreign Minister Lavrov. How do you respond? How do you think about high-level policy-connected Americans engaging with this Russian government at this time?
Well, so I have a lot of respect for all three men. And I think it's important to know that they are not part of the U.S. government. They are acting on their own. And I think that while communication with adversaries, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's another country, is always an important thing, it's also important to make sure you're in sync with your own government when you're doing that, number one. And number two, in this case, having discussions about Ukraine without Ukraine is, not part of what the U.S. government says is its policy. And I would just say that if you're not at the table in those kinds of discussions, you're on the menu. And so the Ukrainian people understand that, and they are quite concerned about what this would mean. I'm sure they went into this hoping to create a very positive dynamic and options and various other things. I'm not sure that's where it's coming out.
Yeah, okay, talking about being on the menu, let's move to Putin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin. You knew I was going there. So, you did not know he was going to Moscow, neither did I. That was a bit of a surprise. He now is in Belarus, as best as we can tell, along with a bunch of his troops. His media company's been shut down, but he still has access to a lot of his cash. To what extent do you think that all of this, the outcome of that unprecedented move against Putin, is that an opportunity for the West? Is it a danger for the West? How does it change the way we think about this conflict and Russia?
I think that, first of all, we need to understand that whether, it's an American expert talking about it, or frankly, even a Russian expert, Russian sources I'm reading, they're speculating too as to what is really going on and what is Putin's game plan and so forth. So I think there's more speculation than hard facts is the first thing. And the other thing that I would know is it's not done. There are probably a number of different phases of the Prigozhin rebellion, and we're not at the end of it yet. I think, you're seeing a purge of Russian generals quitting, publicly criticizing, taking kind of a leaf out of Prigozhin's playbook. I was shocked when the Kremlin put out information that Putin met not only with Prigozhin, but a number of his top leaders 5 days after the rebellion. I thought my head was going to explode. Is this more disinformation? Was this true? What was the point? Where is it going? I think it's hard to draw final conclusions, but I do think that Putin was weakened by this, and he's now trying to gather up that strength and figure out what his next steps are. And as with all dictators, it's narrowing your circle, punishing not necessarily the guilty, but punishing the ones you don't trust, and trying to staunch the bleeding. But I think there's going to be an effect not only on Wagner and whether it gets split apart or kept together but under tighter Putin control, but also on the Russian military itself, which is has already had morale and supply problems. All the problems we all know about, but they are now just going to be exacerbated. So you started the question by asking whether this was an opportunity for the West, and I think that actually the Biden administration handled this exactly right by saying, this is an internal Russian issue, and you all need to sort that out, and we are not playing any part in this. The U.S. government has not had a great track record when it comes to, picking new governments in foreign countries, and I think we should stay out of it.
Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, thanks for joining us on GZERO World.
Thank you for having me.
That's our show this week. Come back next week. And if you like what you see, or even if you don't, but you're hungry for another grain deal, take a minute to sign up for our most excellent morning newsletter. It's called GZERO Daily.